There's a certain kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from being affected by too much. Not the big things, not the moments that truly matter, but the small, constant interruptions. A comment that lingers longer than it should. A tone that shifts your mood. Someone's behavior that stays in your mind even after they've left the room. You move through your day, but parts of your attention keep getting pulled away, as if something inside you is always slightly available to whatever happens around you. And after a while, that starts to add up. You find yourself thinking about things that don't deserve that much space, replaying moments that should have passed, adjusting your mood based on people who are not even present anymore. It's subtle, but it slowly changes how you experience your life. Not because everything around you is heavy, but because too many things are being carried as if they are. That's where the idea of being unbothered is often misunderstood. Most people think it means not caring, not feeling, becoming distant or detached in a way that cuts you off from life. But that's not what it really is. Being unbothered is not about shutting down your emotions. It's about becoming more selective with what gets access to them. It's the ability to notice something without letting it take over your inner state, to experience a moment without turning it into something you carry, to stay connected to yourself, even when the environment around you is trying to pull your attention in different directions. And once that shift begins, something starts to change in a way that feels almost unfamiliar at first. You become less reactive to things that once felt personal. You stop chasing clarity from people who were never offering it. You begin to feel a kind of distance, not from life, but from unnecessary disturbance. And in that distance, your energy starts returning to you. This episode is about that state. Not indifference, not avoidance, but a quieter form of control. The kind that allows you to move through the same world, face the same people, experience the same situations, without giving each of them the power to shape how you feel, think, or respond. Because once you understand what it really means to be unbothered, you start to notice something simple. A lot of what has been affecting you only had that power because it was being allowed in. So before anything else, we need to begin there, with the quiet shift that happens when you stop giving every small trigger a place inside your mind. 1. You stop giving power to small triggers. A surprising amount of emotional exhaustion comes from things that were never important enough to deserve it. Not the obvious wounds, not the truly painful events, but the smaller moments that get under your skin and then stay there longer than they should. A dismissive tone, a careless remark, a look that feels slightly wrong, a message that arrives colder than you expected. None of these things seem large on their own, and yet they can quietly take over far more of your inner life than they deserve. What makes them powerful is rarely the moment itself. It is the access you give it afterward. That is the part people often miss. A trigger does not become significant only because it happened. It becomes significant because your mind keeps returning to it, feeding it, revisiting it, adding interpretation to it, allowing it to spread into other parts of your day. Something small enters through one moment, but then it gets to stay for hours. It changes your mood, it shapes your thoughts, it redirects your energy. And by the time the day is over, you are carrying something that should have disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. That is how small triggers gain power. Not because they are deep truths every time, and not because you are weak for noticing them, but because your inner world has become a little too available to every passing disturbance, too ready to give meaning, too ready to personalize, too ready to turn friction into emotional weight. And once that pattern becomes familiar, life starts feeling heavier in ways that are difficult to explain. You are not dealing with one great burden. You are dealing with constant tiny intrusions. Small things keep entering, and very few of them are being released. That accumulation becomes its own form of fatigue. You wake up already slightly tense. You move through the day with less room inside yourself than you used to have. You become easier to unsettle because so much of your energy is already occupied. This is where being unbothered begins to change something important. It does not mean you suddenly stop noticing people. It does not mean you become emotionally numb. It means you stop turning every minor disruption into an internal event. You learn to feel the moment without building a home for it. You notice the irritation, the awkwardness, the disrespect, the shift, but you no longer rush to let it settle into your nervous system as if it belongs there. That is a form of discipline, because many triggers survive through immediate identification. The moment something feels off, the mind says, "This matters. This means something. This needs attention," and in some situations, that is true. But in many others, what you are reacting to is not truth. It is stimulation. It is your ego, your sensitivity, your anticipation, your old patterns trying to make the moment feel bigger than it is. And if you do not know how to pause there, the small thing becomes large simply because it found an easy place to land. Being unbothered makes that landing harder. You begin to create a little distance between what happens and what stays. A little more room between the trigger and the story your mind wants to build around it. You become less eager to follow every irritation inward. And over time, that changes the quality of your days in a very real way. Things pass through faster. Your mood becomes less fragile. Your attention stays with what actually matters, instead of constantly being diverted by things that only feel important because they touched a nerve. This is one of the deepest forms of freedom a person can develop. Because once you stop giving power to small triggers, you recover so much of your life. Your mornings become cleaner. Your conversations become lighter. Your focus becomes more stable. Your emotional energy stops being spent on moments that never had the depth to justify it. And what you begin to notice is that a great deal of peace does not come from changing the world around you. It comes from no longer allowing every small thing in that world to leave a mark. So maybe the next time something minor catches your attention in that familiar way, something that would usually follow you longer than it should, you stay with the moment just long enough to ask whether this truly deserves space inside you, or whether it only found an old opening. That question alone can start loosening the grip of things that once moved you too easily, because not everything that touches you deserves to stay with you. And becoming unbothered begins the moment you stop confusing a small trigger with something that has earned power over your inner life. 2. People lose interest when they can't provoke you. A lot of human behavior is less sincere than it first appears, not always in a malicious way, but in a patterned one. People often learn, consciously or not, that certain kinds of energy get results. A sharp tone gets attention. A dismissive comment gets a reaction. A small act of disrespect unsettles the room. A vague message pulls someone closer. And once that pattern works a few times, it tends to repeat itself. Not because the person is always deeply manipulative, but because reaction is rewarding. If someone says something careless and your whole state shifts, they feel that shift, even if nothing is said directly. If they create tension and you rush to close it, they learn that their behavior has reach. If they provoke and you become visibly affected, they receive proof that they can enter your inner world more easily than they should. That proof becomes its own kind of encouragement. It teaches them that a certain kind of behavior works around you. This is one of the hidden reasons being unbothered changes relationships so much. When you stop reacting the way people expect, a pattern breaks. The familiar exchange no longer completes itself. The comment lands, but nothing dramatic follows. The tone shifts, but your attention does not rush toward it. The attempt to unsettle you meets less movement than before, and in that stillness, something important happens. The reward disappears. That can feel small in the moment, but it has a deeper effect than most people realize. A great deal of annoying, provocative, or attention-seeking behavior survives not because it is meaningful, but because it continues to produce an emotional payoff. Once that payoff is gone, the behavior begins to lose momentum. Some people reduce it without even realizing why. Some become quieter, some stop testing, and some drift away entirely because what they were really interacting with was not you, but your reactions. That is often a hard truth to see, because it forces you to question what kind of connection was really there. Was the bond built on respect or on access? Did they value your presence, or did they value your emotional availability? Were they drawn to who you are, or to how easily you could be moved? Silence and calm often help reveal that. But being unbothered makes it even clearer because it removes the emotional reward without needing to create distance in an obvious way. You are still there. You still see what is happening. You are simply no longer offering your nervous system as a place for their behavior to land so easily. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because when people cannot provoke you, they lose one of the easiest ways to influence the atmosphere around you. They can no longer steer the interaction through tension alone. They can no longer keep themselves central by making you emotionally manage the room. They have to relate to you in a different way, one that is often cleaner and more honest, or they begin to lose interest altogether. That loss of interest can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to equating intensity with significance. When the drama drops, the connection may feel quieter, flatter, less charged. But often what you are losing is not depth. It is stimulation. It is the false importance that comes from always being pulled into someone else's pattern. And once that fades, you begin to see things more clearly. You notice who still shows up without needing to stir the waters. You notice who speaks with more respect when reaction is no longer easy to extract. You notice who simply loses energy because there is nothing left for them to feed on. That clarity is useful, not because it teaches you to distrust everyone, but because it helps you stop mistaking provocation for relevance. Some people only stay emotionally active in your life because you keep proving to them that they can affect you. When that stops, they do not know what to do with your steadiness. And in many cases, that is exactly what reveals the nature of the connection. So maybe the shift here is not about trying to appear strong. It is about no longer offering unnecessary reactions as a form of fuel. The next time someone says something designed to hook you, unsettle you, or pull you into a familiar emotional rhythm, you do not have to play your usual part. You can notice it, understand it, and let it stop there. Because the truth is, many people keep doing what works, and once it stops working, their interest often tells you more than their words ever did. 3. Your emotional energy stays intact. One of the quietest ways people lose themselves is not through one major crisis, but through constant small spending. A little energy here, a little attention there, a little irritation that lingers longer than it should. A small interaction that follows you into the next hour. By itself, none of it looks serious. But by the end of the day, you can feel that something in you has been used up. And often you cannot fully explain where it went. That is because emotional energy is rarely lost only in the moments that look dramatic. It is often lost in the background, in overthinking what someone meant, in mentally revisiting something careless they said, in carrying attention long after the moment itself has ended, in letting other people's moods, inconsistencies, or immaturity keep borrowing from your inner life even when they are no longer physically present. This is what being easily bothered really costs. Not just peace in the immediate sense, but capacity. Your ability to focus, to stay present, to care about what actually matters, begins getting weakened by things that were never worthy of that much internal involvement. A person says one unnecessary thing, and half your mental atmosphere changes. A situation goes slightly wrong, and suddenly it follows you into everything else. You are technically still moving through your day, but part of you is now occupied somewhere else. That occupation is expensive, because emotional energy is not unlimited. It affects how you think, how patient you are, how clearly you listen, how much warmth you still have available for the people and work that deserve the best of you. If too much of that energy is being spent on small disturbances, then by the time life asks something real from you, you are already partly drained. That is why being unbothered is not just a personality trait. It is protection. It keeps your emotional energy from leaking into places where it creates no real return. It allows you to notice something without surrendering a whole portion of your day to it. It helps you stop turning every minor disruption into an internal project that now needs to be managed, understood, or emotionally digested. And once that begins to happen, something changes in a very practical way. You feel more available to your own life. Your mind is less crowded because it is not constantly processing leftovers. Your body feels less tense because it is not holding on to things that should have passed. Your attention stays where you choose to place it, instead of being repeatedly stolen by whatever happened to brush against your ego, your expectations, or your old sensitivities. This is one of the reasons emotionally grounded people often seem stronger than others, even when they say very little. It is not always that they have fewer problems. Often, it is that less of their energy is being wasted. They are not giving every moment equal access. They are not opening the gate every time something irritating passes by. They are not letting immaturity, inconsistency, or noise rent space inside them for free. That restraint creates reserves. And reserves matter, because life always asks for something eventually. Real challenge, real disappointment, real grief, real effort. When those moments come, you want your emotional energy available. You want your inner life to still have strength in it. But that becomes much harder if too much of it has already been spent reacting to things that should never have become emotionally expensive in the first place. So maybe the practice here is not only about letting things go, maybe it is about becoming aware of the cost before you pay it. The next time something small begins trying to occupy your thoughts, change your mood, or pull you out of yourself, pause long enough to ask what this is actually worth. Not what it triggered, not what it reminded you of, not how easy it would be to follow it, what it is truly worth. That question can save more of you than you think, because a lot of peace comes from no longer donating your emotional energy to things that never deserved access to it. And being unbothered begins, in part, when you finally decide that your inner life is too valuable to be constantly drained by what is small, passing, and beneath the level of your real attention. 4. You focus on what actually matters. One of the quiet consequences of being easily bothered is not just that you feel more tension. It is that your attention becomes fragmented. It gets pulled in too many directions, often by things that have no real importance beyond the moment they appeared. You start the day with intention, but small interruptions begin to reshape it. A comment shifts your mood. A minor inconvenience takes more space than it should. Something someone said lingers in your thoughts longer than it deserves. And without noticing exactly when it happened, your focus is no longer where you chose to place it. It has been redirected. This is one of the deeper costs of reactivity. Not just emotional disturbance, but loss of direction. Because attention is the foundation of everything that matters. What you build, what you improve, what you deepen, what you understand, all depend on your ability to stay with something long enough for it to develop. And when your attention is constantly being pulled away by small triggers, small irritations, small pieces of noise, you lose the continuity that real growth requires. You are present everywhere, but not deeply present anywhere. That is where being unbothered begins to shift something essential. It allows you to reclaim your attention, not by forcing focus, but by removing what keeps interrupting it. You stop giving your mind to things that do not deserve it. You stop letting every minor disturbance redirect your day. You begin to notice that most distractions are not coming from the outside world alone, but from the way your mind reacts to it. And once that reaction changes, your attention becomes more stable. You can stay with what matters longer. You can think more clearly because your thoughts are not constantly being broken. You can engage more deeply because your energy is not being scattered across unnecessary concerns. And over time, that stability becomes one of your strongest advantages. Because most people are not lacking ability, they are lacking sustained attention. They start something, then get pulled away. They try to focus, then something small interrupts them. They want to build something meaningful, but their mind is constantly responding to what is immediate instead of what is important. And after a while, they begin to feel stuck, not realizing that what is missing is not effort, but continuity. Being unbothered restores that continuity. It gives your mind the chance to stay with something long enough for it to become meaningful. It protects your focus from being constantly hijacked by things that feel urgent but are not important. It helps you develop a clearer sense of priority because your attention is no longer reacting to everything at the same level. That shift can change how your entire life feels. Your days become more intentional. Your work becomes deeper. Your relationships become more present. Your thinking becomes less scattered. You are no longer moving from one emotional interruption to the next. You are moving in a direction with your attention supporting that movement instead of constantly disrupting it. And that creates a different kind of progress. Not rushed, not forced, but steady. At the same time, something else becomes clearer. You begin to see how many things were never truly important in the first place. How much of your attention was being given to moments that added nothing to your life except temporary noise. How often your mind was being pulled into loops that had no real outcome beyond more distraction. That awareness changes what you allow in. You become more selective. Not in a rigid way, but in a natural one. You stop feeling the need to engage with everything. You stop assuming that every thought deserves your time. You begin to understand that protecting your attention is one of the most practical forms of self-respect. So maybe the shift here is not about trying to focus harder. It is about giving yourself fewer things to recover from. Letting small distractions pass without following them. Letting minor disturbances exist without becoming involved in them. Letting your mind stay where you placed it instead of where the environment is trying to pull it. Because once your attention becomes stable, everything that depends on it begins to improve. And being unbothered is one of the quietest ways to make that stability possible. 5. Being unbothered filters out unnecessary drama. A lot of drama survives for one reason that people rarely admit. It keeps finding participation. Not always loud participation, not always obvious conflict, but enough emotional engagement to stay alive. A comment gets answered with tension. A small provocation gets met with explanation. A confusing signal gets rewarded with attention. And before anyone has fully noticed what is happening, something minor has become active, emotional, and strangely difficult to leave behind. That is how unnecessary drama enters so many lives. Not because every situation is truly serious, but because too many situations are given more energy than they deserve. something small appears, and instead of staying small, it begins collecting interpretation, emotion, defense, reaction. The situation expands not because it had real depth, but because people kept feeding it movement. Being unbothered changes that dynamic at the source. It removes the extra emotional material that drama needs in order to grow. The little reaction it was hoping for does not appear. The confusion does not get chased. The tension does not immediately become a conversation. And because of that, the moment is forced to stand on its own. Very often, that reveals how little substance it had in the first place. This is why some people seem surrounded by drama, no matter where they go, while others move through life with far less of it. It is not always that their environments are completely different. Often it is that one person keeps entering patterns that the other person quietly refuses to complete. Drama needs emotional momentum. It needs someone to explain, someone to react, someone to read too deeply into a tone, someone to keep returning to the moment and giving it life after it should have ended. Without that momentum, a lot of what seemed important begins to collapse under its own emptiness. That can be surprising when you first start changing this pattern in yourself. You may notice that situations which once would have turned into long emotional detours now fade much faster. A remark that used to follow you all evening loses its charge by the next hour. A person who thrived on emotional back and forth begins to feel less central in your life. A tense moment that used to grow into something larger ends before it really begins. Nothing magical happened. You simply stopped feeding it. That is one of the quiet strengths of being unbothered. It does not only protect your peace in the immediate sense, it changes what kinds of situations are even able to take shape around you. When people sense that you are not easily pulled into unnecessary emotional movement, many patterns lose their grip before they have the chance to become established. And that matters because drama is expensive in ways that are not always obvious at first. It costs attention, it costs mood, it costs perspective, it costs the quality of your day, and often it costs far more than the situation itself was ever worth. A person can spend hours mentally occupied by something that, without emotional involvement, would have disappeared almost immediately. That is what makes unnecessary drama so deceptive. It feels important while it is active, but once the emotion settles, you often realize there was very little there besides noise and momentum. Being unbothered helps you see that sooner, not by making you dismissive and not by turning you cold, but by helping you recognize when something is trying to become larger than it needs to be. It gives you enough distance to ask whether this moment actually deserves deeper involvement, or whether it is only asking for reaction because reaction is what keeps it alive. That question can change more than people think. Because once you stop participating in unnecessary drama, you start noticing how much of it was never really yours. It was simply available, and your nervous system had grown used to entering it. But availability is not obligation. Just because a situation invites your emotional involvement does not mean it has earned it. So maybe the next time something begins to stir that familiar kind of tension, the kind that usually leads to more words, more explanation, more inner replay, you stay still long enough to see whether there is any real substance underneath it. You let the moment remain small until it proves otherwise. You stop assuming that everything emotionally charged is meaningful, because many things are only dramatic because someone agreed to help them become that way. And being unbothered often begins with quietly refusing to be that person anymore. 6. You gain psychological independence. There is a subtle kind of dependence that many people live with without fully recognizing it. It is not about needing someone physically, and it is not always obvious in behavior. It shows up in how much your inner state is tied to what others do, say, or feel. Your mood shifts depending on how someone responds. Your clarity changes based on whether you feel understood. Your sense of stability gets affected by someone else's inconsistency. Nothing about your life has physically changed, and yet something inside you moves as if it has. That is not connection. That is dependence at the level of your inner world, and the difficult part is that it can feel very normal. It can even feel like care, like emotional openness, like sensitivity. But over time it creates a situation where your internal state is no longer fully yours. It becomes partially shaped by the behavior, mood, and unpredictability of other people. That is where being easily bothered becomes costly. Because the more reactive you are, the more your inner life becomes available to external influence. A small shift in someone else's behavior can change how you feel for hours. A lack of clarity can pull you into overthinking. A perceived slight can alter your sense of balance, and without noticing, you begin to move through life with less independence than you thought you had. Being unbothered begins to restore that independence. Not by cutting people off, and not by becoming distant, but by reducing how much access they have to your inner state. You still notice what happens. You still understand the interaction. But you are no longer handing over your emotional stability to every moment that involves someone else. That is a very different way of relating. You begin to separate what is yours from what is not. Someone else's mood remains theirs. Their inconsistency does not automatically become your confusion. Their lack of clarity does not become your responsibility to solve. Their reaction does not get to rewrite how you see yourself. And in that separation, something important returns. You begin to feel more like yourself again. Not the version of you that is constantly adjusting, interpreting, or reacting, but the version that remains steady, regardless of what is happening around you. Your thoughts become less influenced by other people's behavior. Your decisions become less tied to how someone else might respond. Your emotional state becomes more stable because it is no longer being pulled in multiple directions at once. That stability is psychological independence. It means your inner world is no longer easily occupied by things that do not belong to you. It means you can stay present with others without becoming absorbed into their state. It means your sense of self is not constantly being negotiated through interaction. This changes how you experience relationships. You become less anxious about how others are behaving because you are not depending on their behavior to maintain your own balance. You become less reactive to inconsistency because you are no longer trying to stabilize something that was never yours to manage. You begin to see people more clearly because you are not filtering everything through how it affects you emotionally in the moment, and that clarity makes your connections cleaner. You can still care, but without losing yourself. You can still engage, but without becoming entangled. You can still be present, but without handing over your internal stability in the process. That is a different kind of freedom than most people are used to. It is not the freedom of being alone. It is the freedom of being internally grounded even when you are not. So maybe the shift here is not about changing other people. It is about changing the level of access they have to your inner life. The next time something external begins to pull at your mood, your thoughts, or your sense of stability, you pause long enough to notice whether that influence is actually yours to carry. You create a small distance between what is happening outside you and what you allow to take root inside, because that distance is where independence begins. And being unbothered is often the first step toward reclaiming it. 7. It breaks attention-seeking behavior around you. A lot of difficult behavior is less about truth and more about pull. It is not always trying to communicate something real. Sometimes it is simply trying to draw energy, to become the center of the room, to make sure attention shifts in its direction. That can happen through irritation, exaggeration, passive aggression, emotional inconsistency, or the kind of small disruptive behavior that seems insignificant until you notice how often it succeeds. What gives that behavior its power is not only the behavior itself, it is the response it produces. The moment attention moves toward it, something is reinforced. The person sees, consciously or not, that this is a way to affect the atmosphere, to interrupt the flow, to become important for a moment. And once that becomes effective, it tends to repeat. Not because it is meaningful, but because it works. That is why being unbothered changes so much. When you stop giving immediate emotional attention to behavior that is clearly trying to pull you in, the pattern loses one of its main rewards. The moment no longer expands the way it used to. The room does not reorganize itself around it so easily. The person does not receive the same signal that their disruption has reached, and because of that, the behavior often begins to weaken. This is not about pretending not to notice. It is not about becoming passive or ignoring things that truly matter. It is about recognizing when a situation is asking for clear action and when it is asking for emotional participation that only makes it stronger. Many attention-seeking patterns do not survive because they are powerful. They survive because they keep finding people willing to energize them. Being unbothered quietly removes that energy. You stop rushing to engage with every provocation. You stop making every dramatic moment the center of your focus. You stop giving repeated attention to things that become larger only because someone keeps feeding them with emotional importance. And once that shift happens, you begin to notice that many patterns lose their momentum on their own. Some people calm down when they realize the old behavior no longer gets the same reaction. Some become more direct because they can no longer rely on disruption to get your attention. Some drift away from those patterns entirely because the reward has disappeared. And some grow more obvious for a while because the loss of response makes the pattern reveal itself more openly before it fades. That can be uncomfortable at first. Because when you stop reinforcing a pattern, there is often a brief period where it tries harder before it weakens. The behavior becomes more visible, more exaggerated, or more persistent for a time. And if you do not understand what is happening, it can tempt you into returning to your usual role just to make the moment easier. But that is usually the point where the shift matters most, because if you stay steady there, the pattern has far less room to continue. It can no longer depend on your energy to keep itself alive. And once that becomes clear, you begin to understand how much unnecessary behavior in life only survives because someone keeps rewarding it with attention. This changes relationships in subtle but important ways. Your environment becomes less emotionally cluttered. Conversations become cleaner. People begin learning that access to your attention is not automatic simply because they create noise. And over time, that changes what kinds of behavior continue showing up around you, because people adapt to what gets reinforced. If your calmness consistently refuses to energize what is immature, disruptive, or emotionally manipulative, then those patterns begin to lose their place around you. Not all at once, and not in every situation, but enough to change the emotional texture of your life. So maybe the next time someone or something begins trying to pull your attention through tension rather than substance, you do not move toward it immediately. You stay with yourself long enough to see what it actually is. You ask whether this deserves a clear response, or whether it is only trying to become important by being disruptive. That question alone can change a great deal, because many patterns are not asking to be solved. They are asking to be fed, and being unbothered often means quietly deciding that your attention is no longer available for that role. 8. You become harder to control. Control in human interaction rarely looks like control. It doesn't usually come as commands or obvious pressure or something you can easily point to and say, "This is what's happening." More often, it moves through smaller things, through tone, timing, silence, reaction, through the way a moment is shaped just enough to influence how you respond, without you fully noticing it. A shift that makes you feel slightly off balance, a pause that makes you fill the space, a reaction that pulls you into explanation. And if you are not steady inside yourself, these small shifts begin to guide you. Not because you lack intelligence, but because your state becomes easy to influence. That is how control works in subtle ways. It gains access to your reactions, and once it has that access, it does not need to force anything. It can let your own responses carry the interaction forward. You begin adjusting your tone, your timing, your behavior, trying to restore balance, trying to make sense of the moment, trying to reduce the tension you now feel. And without realizing it, you are no longer fully choosing how you respond. You are being guided by the atmosphere. Being unbothered changes that completely. When your internal state is not easily disturbed, the entry point for that kind of influence begins to close. The same tone, the same silence, the same attempt to create pressure no longer has the same effect. You still notice it. You still understand what is happening, but it does not move you in the same way, and that changes the structure of the interaction, because now your responses are no longer shaped by what the moment is trying to pull out of you. They are shaped by what you actually choose to express. There is a gap between what happens and what you do, and inside that gap, your independence remains intact. That is what makes you harder to control. Not because you resist everything, and not because you push back against every attempt to influence you, but because your reactions are no longer easily available. You are not moving automatically with the emotional current of the situation. You are observing it and choosing your place inside it. This creates a different kind of presence, one that is not easily steered. People begin to notice that the usual ways of shifting the interaction do not work the same way with you. The small tactics that once created urgency, confusion, or emotional pressure no longer produce the same results. And because of that, they have to meet you more directly, or they begin to lose their ability to shape the exchange. That clarity is important, because it shows you how much of control depends on access rather than force. If someone cannot easily move your internal state, they have far less influence over how the interaction unfolds. They can still speak, they can still act, but they cannot easily reorganize your thinking or your behavior around their energy. That makes your position more stable, not in a confrontational way, but in a grounded one. You are no longer being pulled into roles you did not choose. You are no longer adjusting yourself to match every shift in tone. You are no longer trying to stabilize something that was created outside of you. You remain where you are, and that steadiness changes how much power the moment has over you. At the same time, something else becomes clearer. You begin to see where influence was happening before. You notice the patterns that once pulled you in, the moments where you used to react quickly, explain too much, or adjust your behavior to match something that felt slightly off. And because you are no longer inside those patterns in the same way, you can recognize them more easily. That awareness is part of what protects you. Because once you see how something works, it becomes much harder for it to work the same way again. So maybe the shift here is not about trying to become untouchable or immune to everything. It is about becoming less available to automatic reaction. The next time something tries to pull you into a certain emotional rhythm, you stay with yourself long enough to see whether that rhythm actually belongs to you, because the less you move automatically, the less you can be moved by others. And being unbothered is often the quiet decision to remain in control of your own state, even when the moment is trying to take it from you. 9. Your self-worth stops depending on others. There is a quiet kind of dependence that can shape a person's entire emotional life without ever being named directly. It happens when your sense of yourself becomes too connected to how others respond to you. Not in a dramatic way, and not always in ways that are easy to notice, but in smaller patterns that repeat until they begin to feel normal. You feel a little better when someone gives warmth, a little less steady when they become distant, a little more certain when you are understood, a little more shaken when you are dismissed. And if that pattern continues long enough, something important begins to slip. Your self-worth stops feeling like something rooted within you. It starts feeling like something you have to keep reading in other people's faces, tones, replies, and reactions. That is one of the deeper reasons being easily bothered can be so painful. It is not only that the moment unsettles you, it is that the moment touches something beneath it. A need to feel chosen, respected, valued, seen clearly, treated well enough to confirm that you still matter. So when someone is careless, cold, dismissive, inconsistent, or simply absent in a way that stirs old sensitivities, the emotional response often becomes heavier than the moment itself would justify. Because the moment is not just being experienced, it is being measured against your sense of worth. That makes life unnecessarily unstable. Your mood rises and falls with other people's behavior. Your confidence changes according to how you were received. Your inner balance becomes tied to variables you do not control, and often to people who are far too inconsistent to be trusted with that level of influence. Being unbothered begins to loosen that dependence, not by making you incapable of feeling hurt, but by teaching you not to derive your value from every interaction. You begin to understand that someone else's mood is not a verdict on you. Their inconsistency is not proof that you are lacking. Their inability to see you clearly does not reduce what is already there. Their behavior may still reveal something important about the relationship, but it no longer gets to define your relationship with yourself. That is a profound shift, because once self-worth begins moving inward, the outside world loses some of its power to rearrange you. A disappointing interaction still feels disappointing, but it does not collapse your sense of self. A moment of disrespect still tells you something useful, but it does not become evidence that you are not enough. Someone's distance may still hurt, but it no longer turns into a quiet argument against your own value. And that changes the emotional structure of your life. You stop chasing reassurance in the same way. You stop over-explaining just to remain likable. You stop trying to manage how people see you as if their perception is the final authority on who you are. You begin to hold on to yourself more firmly, and because of that, you become less vulnerable to the endless fluctuations of human behavior. This does not make you proud in the unhealthy sense. It does not make you closed off, superior, or impossible to reach. It simply makes your worth less negotiable, less available to revision every time someone is moody, immature, distracted, selfish, or unable to meet you where you are. That steadiness creates freedom. You begin choosing people with more clarity because you are not secretly asking them to complete your sense of self. You begin leaving situations sooner when they are costing too much because you are no longer bargaining with your dignity in exchange for emotional validation. You begin to feel more peaceful in your own company because your inner life is not constantly leaning outward, waiting for confirmation that you matter. And that is where being unbothered becomes deeply personal. It is not only about not reacting, it is about no longer outsourcing your worth. The next time something or someone unsettles you in that familiar way, it may help to pause before you follow the feeling all the way inward. To ask whether what hurts is truly the moment itself, or whether the moment has touched an old need to be affirmed by someone who should never have had that responsibility in the first place. that pause can begin changing the whole pattern. Because the more your worth depends on others, the more power you unknowingly hand them. And the more it returns to you, the less every careless moment is able to disturb the foundation of who you are. 10. It builds internal stability. There is a kind of stability that has very little to do with how calm your life looks from the outside. A person can have a quiet routine, familiar relationships, predictable days, and still feel inwardly unsteady. Their mood keeps shifting with other people's behavior. Their thoughts keep getting pulled by small tensions. Their sense of balance is always slightly vulnerable to what happens next. That is because external order is not the same as internal stability. Internal stability is something else. It is the ability to remain connected to yourself even when the moment changes, even when something unexpected happens, even when someone disappoints you, misunderstands you, ignores you, provokes you, or brings a certain kind of emotional weather into the room. It is the difference between being aware of what is happening and being rearranged by it. And that difference becomes much clearer when you begin learning how to stay unbothered. Because being easily bothered does more than create temporary discomfort. It weakens your center. It teaches your inner world to move too quickly with what is happening around it. A small shift outside you produces a larger shift inside you. One comment changes your mood. One delay changes your energy. One awkward interaction follows you long after it should have ended. Over time, that creates a life that feels emotionally unstable, even when nothing dramatic is technically wrong. You may still function well. You may still do what needs to be done. But inwardly, there is too much movement, too much unnecessary disturbance. Being unbothered begins to quiet that movement, not by making you emotionally flat, but by reducing how much external noise is allowed to penetrate the deeper structure of your inner life. Things still happen, you still notice them, but they do not automatically enter the center of you. They remain closer to the edge, and because of that, your inner state begins to feel less changeable, less easily thrown off, less dependent on perfect conditions in order to remain steady. That is how internal stability is built. It is not built through one grand decision. It is built through repetition, through the quiet pattern of not following every trigger inward, through the habit of letting small disturbances remain small, through choosing, again and again, not to let the outside world constantly reorganize your thoughts, emotions, and sense of self. At first, the change can feel almost invisible. You simply notice that things pass through you faster. You recover more quickly. You are less likely to carry one interaction into the rest of the day. You stop needing as much time to emotionally reset after small moments of friction. And then, over time, you realize something deeper has changed. You are not just recovering faster. You are becoming harder to destabilize in the first place. That matters more than people realize, because a stable inner life changes how everything else feels. Your thinking becomes cleaner because your mind is not always defending against interruption. Your relationships become healthier because you are not constantly overreading every shift. Your work becomes more focused because your attention is not being repeatedly scattered by things that should never have been allowed to matter that much. Even your physical energy often feels different because the body is no longer carrying the same low-grade emotional instability all day long. And perhaps the most important change is this. You begin trusting your own ground. You no longer feel like your peace is a temporary condition that can be taken from you by any careless person or any difficult moment. You begin to feel that there is something in you that holds, even when life around you does not. Something that remains yours. Something that does not disappear every time the environment becomes emotionally noisy. That is a powerful thing to experience, because many people are not only tired from life, they are tired from never feeling internally settled within it. They are always adjusting, always recovering, always being moved. And after a while, they begin to think that is just how life is. But often what they are really living inside is not life itself. It is the absence of an inner center, strong enough to remain steady while life moves. Being unbothered helps build that center. So maybe the next time something small tries to pull you off balance, you do not only ask how to get through the moment. Maybe you ask what kind of person you are becoming each time you allow or refuse that disturbance entry. Because every small reaction is shaping something deeper than the moment itself. It is shaping your internal structure. And the more you protect that structure, the more your life begins to feel supported from within. Not because the world has finally become easy, but because you are no longer depending on ease in order to remain whole. 11. You become mentally untouchable. There is a point in this process where something deeper begins to settle, not just in how you react, but in how you are affected at all. Not in a dramatic way, and not all at once. It happens gradually, almost quietly, until you begin to notice that certain things no longer reach you the way they used to. Not because you are ignoring them, not because you are suppressing anything, but because they no longer find a place to land. That is what it means to become mentally untouchable. It does not mean nothing ever bothers you. It means fewer things have access to disturb your inner state in the first place. The same comment that once stayed in your mind for hours now passes more quickly. The same behavior that once made you question yourself now reveals more about the other person than about you. The same tension that once pulled you into reaction now feels like something you can observe without becoming part of it. That shift changes everything. Because when your mind is no longer easily entered, your life becomes less crowded. You are not constantly carrying traces of other people's moods, opinions, or inconsistencies. You are not revisiting the same moments, trying to understand them from 10 different angles. You are not negotiating your sense of self every time someone behaves in a way that would have unsettled you before. You are simply less affected. And that does not make you distant from life. It makes you less available to what does not deserve you. There is a difference. A person who is emotionally closed avoids experience. A person who is mentally untouchable experiences things fully, but does not let everything become internal. They can feel a moment, understand it, even respond to it when necessary, but once it is over, it does not continue living inside them without permission. That creates a kind of freedom that is difficult to explain until you feel it. You begin to move through situations with less internal resistance. Conversations end when they end, instead of continuing in your head. Other people's behavior informs your understanding, but it does not rearrange your inner balance. You stop needing to resolve everything emotionally in order to move forward. And in that space, your mind becomes lighter, clearer, more your own. This is often the point where people notice a deeper change in themselves. Not just that they react less, but that they feel different internally. More stable, more contained, less scattered, less vulnerable to random disturbance. They may not describe it in those exact words, but they feel the difference in how they move through their day. Things no longer stick the same way. That is the sign that something fundamental has shifted. Because most people are not overwhelmed by life itself. They are overwhelmed by how much of it stays with them. Every interaction, every irritation, every unresolved moment becomes something they carry forward. And after a while, their mind becomes crowded with pieces of experiences that should have ended long ago. Being unbothered changes that pattern at its root. It teaches your system that not everything needs to be stored, not everything needs to be processed deeply, not everything deserves to become part of your internal landscape. And once that becomes natural, you begin to experience something that feels almost unfamiliar at first: lightness. Not because life is lighter, but because you are carrying less of what does not belong to you. And that is where being mentally untouchable becomes less about strength and more about clarity. You see what is happening without being consumed by it. You understand people without becoming entangled in their behavior. You move through situations without letting each one leave a mark that has to be managed later. So maybe the final shift is this: you stop trying to protect yourself from everything, and you start allowing fewer things to reach you at all. Because the more selective your inner world becomes, the less the outside world is able to disturb it. And at that point, you realize something simple: you are still in the same world. But the world no longer lives inside you the same way it used to. There is a moment, somewhere along this process, where you begin to notice that your life feels quieter in a way that has nothing to do with silence. The same people are still around, the same situations still happen, the same unpredictability is still part of life. But something inside you is no longer responding to all of it the way it used to. And that changes everything, because being unbothered is not about building walls between you and the world. It is about removing the habit of letting everything enter you without question. It is about no longer treating every moment as if it deserves your full emotional participation. It is about learning that awareness does not require absorption, and that presence does not require you to carry what does not belong to you. That is where real control begins, not in changing what happens, but in deciding what gets to stay. You stop following every thought that pulls at you. You stop giving every reaction the right to define your state. You stop measuring yourself through every interaction. And slowly, your inner life begins to feel more like your own again. That is the part most people are actually searching for. Not a life without difficulty, not a life without people, not a life without tension, but a life where those things do not constantly take something from you. A life where you can move through what happens without carrying all of it forward. A life where your mind is not always occupied by things that have already ended. And that becomes possible the moment you stop feeding what was never meant to grow. Being unbothered is not indifference. It is clarity. It is the ability to recognize what matters and to leave the rest where it belongs. Outside you, passing through, temporary, without turning it into something that lives inside your thoughts, your body, and your sense of self long after the moment has gone. And once that becomes natural, something else begins to fade without effort. The need to react, the need to fix, the need to chase meaning in everything. You begin to feel less pulled, less scattered, less dependent on how the moment unfolds. And in that steadiness, you start to experience something that is easy to overlook, but difficult to replace. Freedom, not from the world, but from being constantly affected by it. So maybe that is what stays with you after everything else. Not a technique, not a rule, but a quiet understanding you return to when something tries to pull you in again. That you do not have to give your attention to everything that asks for it. That you do not have to let every disturbance become personal. That you can remain where you are, even when the moment tries to move you. Because the more you live that way, the more you begin to see something clearly. A lot of what once controlled you only did so because it was allowed to, and being unbothered is the moment you decide that access is no longer automatic.